In November of 1946, in Nuremberg, Germany, we embarked on something that the world had never seen, holding the world's criminals, the Nazis, accountable. And during these trials, German after German, Nazi after Nazi came forward and answered the fundamental question, where did you get the motivation to carry out such horrors? And German after German and Nazi after Nazi gave the same answer: the Americans. In the 1920s, America gave birth to an ideological movement known as eugenics. Eugenics is the central idea of this speech. So we're going to define it, and I'm going to repeat it twice so that you've got it in your head. Eugenics is more or less the study of how to produce the most ideal human being. Again, that is the study of how to produce the most ideal human being. But it's a question that sticks with us, because fast forward nearly 100 years, MIT Technology Review of April 2022 says that women who use filters on Snapchat or Instagram are 70% more likely to want plastic surgery. 40% of men last year looked up how to enlarge their penis. Yeah, go ahead and sit with that one. And all of the time, I am sitting here wondering what it might be like to sit down and have a conversation with a Nazi. To ask the question, how could you do this? Let's say that Nazi's name is, let me pick a name out of a hat, Brianna. And if you were to ask Brianna the question of why she would want to get rid of a certain baby, she might say something like, because that's not how the baby is supposed to be. Now, we have largely left behind the idea of Nazism, or at least I thought we did, but for the most part we have, and we think we've left behind the idea of eugenics. The centering argument of this speech is that we haven't. But in order to know where we're going, we first have to know where we've been. So this speech examines the evolution of this idea of eugenics. I'm going to go over three main points. I'm going to first talk about the early history, or the ideal body as unattainable. Then I'm going to talk about the birth of the average body and the rise of statistics. And then last, I'm going to talk about reinterpreting the tails as a statistical phenomenon. Now, I realize that I am Asian, but I'm actually at math. So if I make some mistakes along the way, pardon my French. If I make some mistakes along the way, hopefully you will bear with me. Let's go ahead and start with this first idea. So in the late 1700s, we start off with this idea of the ideal body as unattainable. And prior to the 1700s, if you go back and read books, look at paintings, look at poems, they talk about this idea of beauty and the body as fundamentally unattainable. If you were to ask somebody in the 1600s, let's say their name was Brianna, you might ask, and they would say something like, a beautiful person is a god. A beautiful person was compared to mythological figures like Helen of Troy or Venus, the Roman god of beauty. In this photo, you have a late 1700s painting. One of my favorite things to do if you find this photo boring, perhaps, is I will walk around contemporary art museums trying to come up with interesting captions. Mine for this is, look at all these women I got. I'm straight killing it. This story captures the famous 6th century painter Zeuxis, and he was tasked by the king at the time to paint the most beautiful woman, and that most beautiful woman was modeled after the Greek god of beauty, Aphrodite. In order to do so, he gathered every beautiful woman that he could find in the city of Chronatus and took out certain parts of each one. For example, one woman's eyes, another's smile, another's height, another's hair. And I always think to myself, can you imagine being the woman whose belly button got picked? Like, your face, ugly as shit, but your belly button, I'm in. This idea of putting together all of these different parts of a woman and creating beauty was the pre-modern idea of what beauty actually was. For us, the takeaway then is that what is to be beautiful, what is to be ideal, is to be a god. It is not to be human. Fast forward a couple centuries, and our ideas have radically changed. When we look at who are the most beautiful women in the world, we have women like Kate Upton and Priyanka Chopra. And when we think about the men you don't get away either. Michael B. Jordan, yes ma'am. We have these different ideas of beauty. Beauty now resides in the actual body. It's not in the heavens, it's here on earth. And now, beauty is something that we are supposed to strive for, not merely idolize. Let me pause here, because this is a speech about eugenics, and that is kind of a drab at the end of the day. But I gotta say, I really enjoyed this part of researching. So as we move beyond the late 1700s, we begin to get the idea of the average and the statistics. So a quick story. In the late 1700s, there was a French statistician named Quetelet. I'm not going to try to pronounce his first name. If you want it, text me. Quetelet is a French statistician who became really interested in this idea of the law of errors. So let's rewind for a moment and imagine early astronomers. When they were trying to locate stars in the sky, everybody would kind of point to different areas in the sky. So what he did was he began plotting all of the different guesses that people would have. And then astronomers would average out all of those guesses, and usually the average was the most accurate prediction. Thus gave birth to this idea of the average as being important. Fast forward a couple decades after Quetelet, and we begin to get these ideas of the bell curve as statistics begins to rise in the 1830s. In 1835, in fact, the Royal London Society of Statistics begins to emerge. Big names like Thomas Malthus, Charles Babbage, Francis Galt, and Carl Pearson all begin to emerge. But for our purposes, notice the subtle shift. It went from the gods to here on earth to what is average. And through these statisticians, we begin to really fetishize or glorify this idea of what it means to be average. For example, we begin to ask ourselves, what is the average height of a man? Now, if you look in the blue, you will see right there at 5 feet tall on the tail of the bell curve, me at 5 feet tall. Just let that sink in for a moment. It doesn't feel good. However, if you move on down to 6 feet tall, right at the edge of the bell curve, we have another speaker here, Dr. Kromka, at 6 feet tall. This idea of laying out statistics in this way and telling us what we ought to be begins this glorification of the average. And if you don't believe me, 65% of Americans, when asked, what class are you, will say they're average or middle class, despite only 22% of the country actually qualifying as middle class. In addition, according to the 2018 book, Everybody Lies, Big Data and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Ourselves, for every one woman who looks up the average size of a male penis, 170 men Google the same thing. They're not asking what the biggest penis on earth is, they're asking what the average is, because they want to be in the middle. They want to be average. This fetishization of average began to introduce a problem, though, for theorists. As they moved along, they noticed, well, if the ends or the tails of the bell curve are both deviant, they're both a problem, well, we have to figure out a way to praise the right end. And so they began to manipulate math. And that brings us into the third era, post-1880s, where we see we are reinterpreting the tales. Instead of seeing the bell curve as a general mathematical formula, we begin to praise the right side. And mathematicians come up with new ideas of how to praise those who are above 6 feet tall, who are above average intelligence, who perhaps have larger penises. Whatever it might be, this idea begins to manipulate the very way that we begin to think. And we come up with this idea of percentiles. It's not just falling on either side of the tails. Instead, now we're going to say, you're better than 91% of people. So for me, you can imagine being 12 years old, cute as and somebody tells me I am in the first percentile of height for American men. And here I thought I was on the tail, special and extraordinary. But somebody who's 6'6" or 7 feet tall, they get an NBA contract and largely glorified. This reinterpretation of the tales lead us to today. What do we do with the deviant body? I find myself sometimes thinking about this, and when we look back on the birth of the average, birth of what we consider to be the ideal body, we went from thinking that the ideal was the gods, we went to thinking it was the average, then we went to putting the ideal as something just beyond our reach, something that needs a filter, something that needs plastic surgery, something that tells us that we are fundamentally wrong. All of this takes me back to a southwestern Ohio hospital in the early 1990s. And I imagine a conversation between a young Filipino woman and an American veteran coming back from Vietnam and the Philippines and Saudi Arabia, and them sitting down and asking themselves, should we abort this child or not? And I imagine what the doctor said. Something like, this isn't how the child is supposed to be. What is supposed to be? That's what I'll leave you with. Thank you.